Hello, my name's Katie Jones. I'm the Communications Manager at Voluntary Norfolk, and today I'm talking to my colleagues Amy and Amelia about the support that Voluntary Norfolk have been offering voluntary groups in Norfolk throughout COVID-19. So, starting with you, Amelia, can you tell us what your job title is and what your normal job role is?
I'm Groups and Membership Officer. I look after the Voluntary Norfolk membership scheme. I also oversee the Momentum grant scheme, and I look after the Staff Hub, and which is a resource that groups in Norwich can use to borrow equipment for community events. And I also just offer general support to small community groups, charities and social enterprises in Norfolk.
And Amy, what about you?
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm the Supporting Excellence Officer in the Momentum team. So my role is around supporting youth organisations and small youth clubs to offer really good quality youth work for young people across Norfolk.
Thank you. Well, we know voluntary groups, just like every other organisation, has been affected by COVID, by lockdown. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you've learned from voluntary groups and what we've been doing. How have they been affected? Were there any particular challenges they faced? Amy, how about you? Starting with youth groups.
Yeah, I mean, youth groups across Norfolk are very, very different. So there's a huge difference between a small volunteer-run youth club and a youth club that might be run by a bigger charity. So the main thing that we did was to try and contact all of our members and find out firsthand from them what their challenges were, because you can't make assumptions about what the challenges are. So we went through a list of all our members, we divided it up between us as to who was going to call who. We did it in collaboration with Community Action Norfolk as well, so they were calling some organisations that they had more contact with. And it was just a really good opportunity to hear from them, just have a bit of a conversation about what's going on and what they're struggling with. And we heard back lots of things, particularly for the youth clubs that were run by volunteers. A lot of them were really worried about how they might keep going. They were worried about the move to online youth activities when they'd not done anything like that before. And I think really it was a huge struggle for a lot of particularly the really smaller groups. But even the bigger organisations were struggling and telling us that they were worried about young people who didn't have access to technology and wouldn't be able to join the online groups, who would be excluded by that. So that was something that came through quite strongly.
Was it the same for you, Amelia? What sort of feedback were you getting from the groups that you contacted?
I think in some senses that the anxieties they had about, coping during the pandemic were the same anxieties that they'd have normally, but were just exacerbated. Funding was probably the biggest issue, finding funding. Interestingly, a lot of groups had quickly found a way to sort of survive the next 3 to 6 months. But what they were telling us is actually, I'm okay for this year to the end of 2020, but I'm really worried about the next 3 years, the next 5 years, about how we plan for the future.
And what sort of support and advice could you provide for the groups? What were you able to signpost or offer support? How were you able to reassure them and help them with their anxieties? Amelia?
I think sometimes it was just being a sounding board, and a couple of groups said to me, and I think they said the same thing to Amy, that they were just really pleased to be able to talk to somebody, and they were just really grateful that we picked up the phone and spoke to them. And it was just really good for them to have somebody to listen to, so they'd talk through some of the issues. A lot of people generally found that they were working in a silo, working from home, and they didn't have that normal sort of networking contact with other groups that they would do normally. And so they didn't know what was happening. So they were really keen to ask us what other groups were doing, how other groups were coping. I think from these conversations, I think that sort of really informed us in how we planned our future work. So thinking about, how can we create networking opportunities online for groups? How can we connect them? How can we show them and share information about how groups are coping? And also about what training and what events would be useful to them. So although we were listening and providing support to them, it was also a really useful way for us to think about how we were going to plan our work in the next 6 months.
And was it the same, Amy? How were you finding, what sort of support were youth groups particularly needing from you?
I'd completely echo what Amelia said about being that sounding board and being able to provide that reassurance. I think that was really crucial. A lot of groups said that they really benefited from hearing about what other groups had done. So we were able to say, oh, actually, I spoke to so-and-so the other day and they said the exact same thing. And people found that really reassuring, that they weren't on their own and they weren't the only ones dealing with that. So that made a huge difference. And from that, we decided to move the Youth Work Network meetings online. So we've been running those on Zoom. Normally we meet face to face and we have quite a fixed agenda, but we did some very loose meetings where we just gathered people together and said, this is a space for you to say what you're struggling with and just receive that kind of peer support. And that's made a really big difference to people. There were a few kind of short-term fixes that we were able to put into place as well using our small grant scheme that Amelia administers. So one organisation said that they were really worried about their young people not having to do computers because they were from refugee asylum seeker backgrounds. So we were able to use our small grant scheme to give them some money to buy some tablets that they could loan out to the young people, because a lot of them were doing their homework on their phones, which wasn't ideal, or having to share one phone between 4 or 5 siblings. So that made a really big difference really quickly, and that was something we could put into place without too much effort on our part, really. It was just something that made a huge difference for quite a small project, if that makes sense.
And I think it shows. I think it shows that being responsive is and being very quick to respond to somebody's needs is really important. Which is why I think having a local network and having this central place where you can ask what resources are available and have the speedy access to funding is so important for groups, particularly small groups, and making funding applications simple as well. I know that there's Better Together grants are also available to make groups, to help them make their groups COVID secure, because of course now, as sort of moving out of lockdown, groups now have the concerns of, the costs associated with making their premises COVID secure. And I think that's another challenge for groups as we go into the next phase of COVID. What can you envisage? I mean, how are groups looking to the future now?
I think it's really difficult. I think it is. I don't think any of us know what the world's going to be like in a year's time. I think all we can do is sort of continue to sort of signpost groups to what's happening, keep them linked into what's happening at county level, what's happening regionally, what's happening nationally, make sure they understand what the local authorities are doing. So make sure they're linked into work that's being done by Norfolk County Council or the local city, borough and district councils as well. So I think we're in a really good position where we've got those contacts. During lockdown, I've got particularly good contacts with the Norwich City Community Enabling Team, so that was really good for groups in Norwich to be able to sort of make that connection with their colleagues over at City Hall. And I think it's, I think what me and Amy say a lot is that we might not know the answer to everything, but we probably know a person that will know the answer to the question. And I think that really was sort of key to during lockdown, how we could sort of, help groups plan for the future. In terms of sort of long-term planning and especially around funding, one of the interesting things that came out of the conversations that we were having with groups when they were talking not just about, I think initially we thought they were going to be asking for emergency, quite small amounts of funding to just help them keep going and survive the lockdown. And although that did happen, maybe what surprised me was actually it wasn't necessarily the short-term funding that they were worried about. It was the long-term planning, and I think that's what encouraged us to return to the idea of the Let's Talk Good Finance event, which we had planned as a face-to-face event, working with Good Finance in April, which, like everything else, had to be cancelled. But it was through these conversations about funding we decided to revisit that contact, and we actually held it in the end of July. We held a Zoom meeting with a big society capital about social investment funding as an alternative way of funding your activities for social enterprises, charities, and even community groups in Norfolk. And so being able to provide that event online, we were able to engage with groups and give them another option. It was also really successful because it was online. We were able to build a really successful partnership with Community Action Suffolk, which would normally be logistically quite difficult to do and really challenging because we're in such geographically different areas. But because it was online, we were able to do that relatively easily. So that was a really big success, and it'd be really interesting to see whether any of the groups or organisations that took part in that, how the information that they learned, that they got from that event, how that informs their planning in the future, whether any of them do actually take up social investment as an option.
And I think it's interesting you're saying about how online has actually in some ways opened up possibilities to people, because the geographical issue of attending training and workshops is quite a big factor. I know that Amy, that you used to spend a lot of miles on the road attending groups, and I think it's quite good in some ways that individuals and groups from across the county can all come together in a much easier way. So hopefully there'll be some things that have come out of COVID that we can take forward, that actually do make things easier and more accessible. But certainly it seems to me that the lesson that's emerged over the last 6 months is that there is definitely support available, and there's definitely people who are in similar boats to you. And if there's any groups or charities working there and feeling anxious about what's going on, get in touch with Voluntary Norfolk, because it's highly likely that there'll be things that you've already dealt with before, you know the answers to, or as you say, know somebody else who knows the answers to. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that you summed it up really well, but I think it's that link to the national organisations as well that we can provide. I see us as sort of, we sit somewhere in between. And one of the things that was really helpful for a lot of the groups I've been supporting is that UK Youth and the National Youth Agency provided an awful lot of resources about how to reopen your youth club in a COVID safe way, and they went through all the government guidance and picked out the stuff that was relevant to youth clubs and wrote it up in a really accessible way, and we were able to provide that to our groups. It's those sorts of things that maybe groups wouldn't have found by themselves. And I know Amelia has linked in a lot with the NCVO development workers to get solutions to some of the problems that our groups are facing. And there's that kind of hive mind of, like Amelia put it, if we don't know the answer, we know someone who does. And that's something that's really valuable.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us today, and thank you for the work you're doing supporting groups in Norfolk.
Thank you.
Thanks.